The December wind carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke through the frost-kissed streets of our small town, wrapping around my shoulders like a familiar embrace as I stood on the front porch of my childhood home. 23 years had passed since I last felt the weathered wooden boards beneath my feet, since I last breathed in the particular mixture of my grandmother's cinnamon candles and the old oak tree that stood sentinel in our front yard. The cold bit at my cheeks, turning them the same shade of red I remembered from countless winter mornings, spent building snowmen with cousins whose faces had grown dim in my memory. My fingers trembled as I reached for the brass doorknob, polished smooth by decades of eager hands. The metal felt like ice against my palm, sending a sharp chill up my arm that had nothing to do with the temperature. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the warm amber glow of lights inside, dancing shadows that spoke of life and laughter continuing without me. The sound of muffled voices drifted through the heavy wooden door, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter that made my chest tighten with a longing I had tried to bury for more than 2 decades. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to identify the voices within. There was Uncle Robert's deep baritone, still commanding attention even in casual conversation. Aunt Margaret's melodic laugh cascaded through the walls, as musical and infectious as I remembered from the days when she would chase us children around the kitchen while frosting sugar cookies. The lighter voices of what must be my cousin's children created a symphony of youth and joy that transported me back to my own childhood, when Christmas Eve at grandmother's house was the most magical night of the entire year. The doorbell felt foreign under my finger, its familiar brass surface now seeming like a formal barrier between myself and the family I had chosen to leave behind. The chime echoed through the house with the same 2-note melody that had announced countless visitors over the years. I heard footsteps approaching, the sound of house slippers shuffling across the hardwood floor I once slid across in my stocking feet. The door opened slowly, revealing my cousin Sarah's face. Time had painted silver threads through her auburn hair and traced laugh lines around her green eyes, but her smile remained exactly as warm and welcoming as it had been when we were children sharing secrets under the Christmas tree. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes widening with recognition and disbelief. Sarah whispered my name like a prayer, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out tentatively, as if afraid I might disappear like a mirage. When her fingers touched my cheek, they were warm and soft, carrying the faint scent of vanilla from the cookies she must have been baking. The simple touch cracked something deep inside my chest, and I felt tears threatening to spill over my carefully constructed composure. Before I could speak, Sarah pulled me into her arms with fierce urgency. Her embrace smelled of home, of Christmas mornings and shared laughter, of the safety I had convinced myself I no longer needed. She held me tightly, and I could feel her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Over her shoulder, I glimpsed the interior of the house that had once been my second home. The hallway stretched before us, lined with the same family photographs that had watched over my childhood adventures. The wooden banisters still bore the tiny scratches my cousin Marcus had made with his pocket knife one summer, marking our heights year after year. Sarah pulled back, holding me at arm's length to study my face. Her eyes searched mine with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. She touched my hair, now shorter and touched with premature gray, and traced the lines around my eyes that spoke of years lived far from family. She told me how much I looked like my mother, her voice barely above a whisper. The comparison hit me like a physical blow, bringing with it a rush of memories I had spent years trying to suppress. My mother's laugh echoing through these same halls, her hands covered in flour as she taught us to make pie crust, her voice raised in harmony with the family as we sang Christmas carols around the old upright piano. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and decades of missed conversations. Sarah's eyes reflected the same uncertainty I felt, the delicate dance of trying to bridge a gap that had seemed impossible to cross. Behind her, I could hear the family continuing their celebration, unaware that the prodigal daughter had returned to their doorstep. Sarah asked if I was ready to come inside, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. She must have seen the fear in my eyes, the way my hands trembled at my sides. I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to turn and run back to the safety of the life I had built far from these complicated relationships and painful memories. She led me through the hallway, past the coat closet where we used to hide during games of hide and seek, past the formal dining room where grandmother would set her finest china for Christmas dinner. The familiar creak of the floorboards under our feet created a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. Every step deeper into the house felt like traveling backward through time, peeling away the years and the carefully constructed distance I had placed between myself and this place. The living room opened before us, a warm cavern of golden light and familiar faces. The Christmas tree stood in its traditional corner, towering nearly to the ceiling and dripping with ornaments collected over generations. Some I recognized from my childhood. The paper angel I had made in 2nd grade, now yellow with age but still holding a place of honor. The wooden nutcracker Uncle Robert had carved when I was 10. The delicate glass bells that had belonged to my great-grandmother, their surfaces catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the room. The conversation stopped abruptly as I stepped into view. Time seemed suspended, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire in the stone fireplace. I could feel the weight of every gaze, the shock and confusion rippling through the room like stones thrown into still water. Children I had never met stared at me with curious eyes, while the adults I once knew as well as my own reflection struggled to reconcile my presence with the years of silence that had preceded it. Uncle Robert rose slowly from his leather armchair, the same chair where he had held me on his lap and read Christmas stories when I was small. His hair had gone completely white, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had worked outdoors his entire life, but his eyes still held the same kindness I remembered. He approached me cautiously, as if I might bolt at any sudden movement. He said my name with wonder, reaching out to touch my shoulder with a gentleness that made my throat constrict with emotion. His hands were still calloused from years of carpentry work, still steady and strong. The familiar scent of sawdust and coffee clung to his flannel shirt, triggering a flood of memories of the workshop behind their house, where he had taught me to whittle and sand and measure twice before cutting once. Aunt Margaret appeared at his side, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had always been the emotional heart of our family, the one who remembered everyone's birthday and made sure no holiday passed without proper celebration. Her silver hair was styled in the same soft waves she had worn for as long as I could remember, and her Christmas sweater depicted a cheerful snowman that seemed to mirror her own radiant smile. She opened her arms without hesitation, drawing me into a hug that smelled of flour and cinnamon, of the kitchen where she had taught me to bake my first batch of chocolate chip cookies. Her embrace felt like absolution, like forgiveness I had not dared to hope for. She whispered welcome home against my ear, and the words unlocked something inside me that I had kept carefully guarded for so many years. Around the room, other family members began to approach. Marcus, Sarah's older brother, had grown into a man I barely recognized, his boyish features now mature and serious. He worked as a teacher now, Sarah explained, introducing his wife and 2 young children who peeked out from behind their father's legs with shy curiosity. The little girl had Sarah's green eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin, while the boy bore a striking resemblance to our grandfather, with the same unruly cowlick that refused to be tamed. Cousin Patricia had driven down from Portland with her teenage daughter, a girl whose defiant posture and colored hair reminded me so strongly of myself at that age that it took my breath away. Patricia herself had softened with motherhood, her once sharp edges rounded by years of patience and compromise. She hugged me carefully, as if testing the waters of our reunion. The younger generation watched our reunion with fascination, these children who had grown up hearing stories about the cousin who had disappeared, who had chosen anger and pride over family connection. I wondered what they had been told about me, whether I existed in their family mythology as a cautionary tale or simply as a mysterious absence that was never quite explained. Sarah guided me to the sofa, settling beside me with the easy familiarity of our childhood friendship. The cushions still bore the impressions of countless family gatherings, still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets grandmother had tucked between them to keep the fabric fresh. Sarah asked about my life, my work, my travels, but her questions carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity about the years we had lost. I found myself telling them about my job as a music therapist in Seattle, about the hospital where I worked with children recovering from traumatic injuries. The words came slowly at first, rusty from years of keeping my professional and personal lives carefully separated. But as I spoke, I began to see glimmers of recognition in their faces, understanding that the skills I used to help healing children were born from the same musical foundation we had all shared in this very room. Uncle Robert asked if I still played piano, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I had not touched a piano in over 15 years, had deliberately avoided the instrument that had once been as essential to me as breathing. The bench in the corner of the room where the old upright piano stood seemed to mock me with its emptiness, a reminder of talents abandoned and connections severed. But Sarah's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. She told me that her daughter Emma, now 16, had been learning to play that same piano. Emma was shy about performing, Sarah explained, but she had been working on a special song for tonight's celebration. Sarah looked toward the stairs, calling for Emma to come down and meet her long-lost cousin. The girl who descended the stairs was a perfect blend of Sarah's grace and Marcus's determination. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes held the same intelligent spark that had characterized our family for generations. She moved with the careful poise of a teenager trying to navigate the complex social dynamics of adult gatherings, unsure of her place in this reunion that had clearly caught everyone by surprise. Sarah introduced us, and Emma shook my hand with formal politeness. But when Sarah mentioned Emma's musical talents, the girl's cheeks flushed pink with embarrassment. She protested that she was not ready to perform, that the song was not perfect yet, that she would make mistakes in front of so many people. I recognized the fear in her voice, the same terror that had once paralyzed me before piano recitals and school performances. But I also heard something else, the unmistakable hunger of a young musician desperate to share her gift but terrified of vulnerability. It was a feeling I understood too well, the double-edged sword of artistic expression that could bring either crushing disappointment or transcendent joy. I asked Emma what song she had been learning, keeping my voice gentle and encouraging. She looked to her mother for support before answering that it was an old Christmas carol, one that had been passed down through our family for generations. My heart began to race as she described the melody, the intricate harmonies that had once filled this room during our childhood celebrations. It was the song my great-grandmother had brought with her from Ireland, the one she had taught to my grandmother, who had taught it to my mother, who had tried to teach it to me before everything fell apart. The melody was complex and haunting, requiring a level of skill that I had never quite mastered despite years of practice. That failure had been one of many disappointments that had eventually driven me away from music altogether. Emma explained that she had found the sheet music in the piano bench, written in my grandmother's careful script. She had been trying to learn it as a surprise for the family, a way to honor the musical tradition that had always been such an important part of our Christmas celebrations. But she was struggling with the more difficult passages, the intricate fingering that made the song so beautiful but so challenging to master. Without thinking, I found myself moving toward the piano. My hands shook as I lifted the bench lid, revealing stacks of sheet music that I had not seen in decades. The familiar smell of old paper and wood polish transported me back to countless hours spent practicing at this very instrument, my small fingers stretching to reach difficult chords, while my grandmother offered patient encouragement from her rocking chair nearby. The sheet music Emma had found was indeed in my grandmother's handwriting, the notes carefully inscribed in her precise script. But as I studied the page, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. In the margins, in faded pencil, were notes written in my mother's distinctive hand. Fingering suggestions, tempo markings, little hearts drawn next to particularly beautiful passages. My mother had been the most accomplished musician in our family, a woman whose talent had been legendary in our small town. She had received a scholarship to study music at the state university, but had given it up to marry my father and raise her children. The sacrifice had left her with a bittersweet relationship to her piano, an instrument that represented both her greatest joy and her greatest loss. I ran my fingers over her penciled notes, feeling a connection to her that I had not experienced since her death 8 years earlier. We had been estranged when she passed, our relationship another casualty of the pride and stubbornness that seemed to run in our family like a genetic defect. I had not even attended her funeral, a decision that had haunted me every day since. Emma asked tentatively if I knew the song, and I found myself nodding despite the tears that blurred my vision. I told her that my mother had tried to teach it to me many years ago, but that I had never been able to master the more difficult sections. The admission felt like confessing to a grave sin, acknowledging a failure that had contributed to the fracture in our family harmony. But Emma's face brightened with excitement. She asked if we could try playing it together, if I could help her with the parts she found challenging, while she helped me remember the sections I had forgotten. The suggestion was both terrifying and irresistible, offering a chance to bridge not only the gap between us, but also the chasm that had opened between myself and the music that had once defined my identity. I sat down on the piano bench, my hands hovering over the keys with the uncertainty of a swimmer preparing to dive into unknown waters. The familiar weight of the keys beneath my fingers brought back muscle memory I thought I had lost forever. My touch was tentative at first, pressing out the simple melody line with the careful precision of someone relearning a forgotten language. Emma slid onto the bench beside me, her smaller hands finding the upper register while mine explored the bass clef. Together, we began to work through the song measure by measure, stopping and starting as we encountered difficulties, laughing at our mistakes, celebrating the moments when the harmony clicked into place with perfect synchronicity. The rest of the family gathered around the piano, drawn by the tentative music that grew stronger and more confident with each repetition. I could feel their presence like a warm blanket, their encouraging murmurs and gentle corrections creating a safety net that allowed me to take risks I had not dared in years. As we played, memories began to surface with startling clarity. I remembered sitting on the same bench as a 7-year-old, my legs too short to reach the pedals, while my mother guided my hands through my first attempts at melody. I remembered the Christmas when I was 12 and had finally mastered a difficult Bach invention, the pride in my mother's eyes brighter than any present under the tree. But I also remembered the arguments, the pressure, the way music had gradually transformed from joy to obligation. I remembered my mother's disappointment when I chose friends over practice, when I announced my intention to study business instead of music, when I finally walked away from the piano bench and declared that I was finished with music forever. The song we were learning carried all of those memories within its measures, the joy and the pain intertwined like the melody and harmony we were creating together. Emma's young voice joined our playing, her clear soprano weaving through the instrumental parts with an intuitive understanding that took my breath away. She sang the lyrics in the traditional Irish Gaelic that my great-grandmother had preserved, the ancient words rolling off her tongue with surprising fluency. Sarah explained that Emma had been working with a language tutor to learn the pronunciation, determined to honor the song's heritage by performing it in its original tongue. The girl's dedication humbled me, reminding me of the passion I had once felt for preserving our family's musical traditions. As we continued to practice, other voices began to join Emma's. Uncle Robert's bass rumbled beneath the melody, followed by Aunt Margaret's alto and Sarah's soprano. Soon the entire room was filled with harmony, voices blending and separating, creating the kind of musical magic that had once been a regular feature of our family gatherings. But there was one voice missing, and its absence created a hole in the harmony that everyone could feel. Patricia, my cousin who had always sung the high descant that soared above the melody like a bird taking flight, stood silently in the corner. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was guarded, resistant to the emotional reconciliation taking place around the piano. I caught her eye and saw the pain there, the unresolved hurt that my departure had caused. Patricia and I had been especially close as children, sharing secrets and dreams in the way that only cousins separated by just 2 years could. My abandonment of the family had hit her particularly hard, and I could see that the wound had never fully healed. The music gradually faded as the others became aware of Patricia's silence. The room grew uncomfortable, charged with the tension of unfinished business and unspoken recriminations. Emma looked between Patricia and me with confusion, sensing the undercurrents but not understanding their source. Sarah tried to smooth over the moment by suggesting we take a break for refreshments, but Patricia spoke up before the group could disperse. Her voice was steady but strained as she addressed me directly for the first time since my arrival. She asked why I had come back now, after so many years of silence, after missing so many important family moments. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or wave away. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably, torn between their joy at my return and their loyalty to Patricia, who had been present for all the milestones I had missed. Graduations, weddings, funerals, births, anniversaries, life had continued in my absence, and Patricia had been there for all of it. I struggled to find words that could explain decades of absence, the complex mixture of pride and pain that had kept me away. I told them about receiving the letter Sarah had sent 3 months earlier, the one that had somehow found me despite multiple address changes and years of deliberate disconnection. In that letter, Sarah had written about our grandmother's failing health, about her desire to see the family reunited one last time before she passed. But my grandmother had died before I could work up the courage to return, and I had once again missed my chance to make things right. The guilt of that missed opportunity had finally broken through my stubborn pride, forcing me to confront the cost of my self-imposed exile. Patricia's expression softened slightly as I spoke, but her posture remained defensive. She told me about sitting with our grandmother during her final weeks, about how the old woman had asked for me repeatedly, convinced that I would come home in time. Patricia had been the one to hold our grandmother's hand when she passed, whispering promises that somehow, someday, the family would be whole again. The weight of that revelation settled over me like a heavy coat, making it difficult to breathe. I had been so focused on protecting myself from potential rejection that I had failed to consider the pain my absence was causing others. My grandmother had died hoping for a reconciliation that my pride had prevented, and Patricia had been left to witness that disappointment firsthand. Emma, who had been listening to our conversation with growing understanding, spoke up with the clarity that only teenagers possess. She asked why we were wasting time talking about the past when we were all together now. She pointed out that our grandmother might be gone, but the rest of us were still here, still capable of creating the harmony she had always wanted to hear. Her words cut through the tension like a knife, exposing the fundamental truth that we adults had been too complicated to see. Emma returned to the piano bench and began playing the melody of our family song, her young voice calling us back to the music that had always been our common language. One by one, we rejoined her at the piano. Uncle Robert's bass anchored the harmony, followed by Aunt Margaret's warm alto. Sarah's soprano wove through the melody with practiced ease, and even the younger children added their voices to the growing chorus. Finally, inevitably, Patricia stepped forward and added her soaring descant, the missing piece that transformed our song from merely beautiful to transcendent. As we sang together, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The anger and resentment that I had carried for so long began to dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming sense of belonging that I had forgotten could exist. This was what I had walked away from in my stubborn pride. Not just the music, but the connection, the sense of being part of something larger than myself. The song reached its climactic moment, the point where all voices joined in perfect unison, before separating into complex harmonies that showcased each singer's unique contribution to the whole. My own voice, rusty from disuse, cracked slightly on the high notes, but nobody seemed to care. They were simply grateful to have me back in the chorus where I belonged. As the final notes faded into silence, we remained gathered around the piano, reluctant to break the spell that the music had woven around us. Emma beamed with pride at having facilitated this musical reunion, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a problem well solved. The adults exchanged glances loaded with emotion, each of us processing the significance of what had just occurred. Patricia was the first to move, stepping forward to embrace me with the fierceness of someone who had waited 23 years for this moment. Her hug was different from the others I had received that evening, more desperate, more complete, as if she were trying to make up for all the embraces we had missed during our years of separation. She whispered apologies against my ear, taking responsibility for hurts that had been mutual, for pride that had been shared equally between us. I apologized in return, my words tumbled together in the rush to finally give voice to years of regret and longing. We cried together, not caring that the rest of the family was watching, not caring that we were grown women behaving like the children we had once been. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, breaking the emotional intensity of the moment with the gentle authority he had always possessed. He suggested that we continue our musical celebration, perhaps working through some of the other songs that had been family favorites during our childhood. The piano bench was large enough for Emma and me to share, and soon we were leading the family through a repertoire of Christmas carols and folk songs that had been passed down through generations. Each song carried its own memories, its own associations with specific Christmas celebrations from our past. Silent Night reminded us of the year Marcus had forgotten the words halfway through and had hummed the rest while we all tried not to laugh. Jingle Bells brought back memories of the Christmas pageant where 5-year-old Sarah had stolen the show by singing louder than the entire rest of the children's choir combined. The Coventry Carol transported us back to the year I was 14, when I had finally mastered the difficult minor key melody and had performed it as a solo while my mother accompanied me on the piano. It had been one of our last successful musical collaborations before our relationship began to deteriorate under the weight of my adolescent rebellion and her disappointed expectations. But tonight, surrounded by family who had welcomed me back without reservation, the song carried no painful associations. Instead, it felt like a celebration of the musical heritage that connected us all, the tradition that had survived my absence and would continue long after we were all gone. As the evening progressed, the gathered family members began to share stories about the years I had missed. They told me about Emma's musical development, how she had discovered the piano at age 8 and had shown an immediate aptitude for complex harmonies. They described Marcus's wedding, a small ceremony in the backyard of this very house, where the family had provided all the music for the celebration. Patricia shared the story of her daughter's birth, how she had hummed lullabies throughout labor, songs that had been sung to us when we were children. She described the moment when her daughter had first responded to music, how the baby's face had lit up when Patricia sang the Irish song we had just performed together. Sarah told me about the Christmas 5 years earlier when they had attempted to perform our family song without me, how the missing harmony parts had made the absence feel even more acute. She described how Emma had asked about the missing cousin, leading to discussions about family dynamics and the sometimes painful complexity of adult relationships. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of experiences I had missed, a reminder of the life that had continued without me. But rather than making me feel more excluded, these stories began to weave me back into the family narrative. I was no longer the absent cousin, but the returned daughter, the voice that had been missing, but was now found. Emma asked if I would teach her more about the technical aspects of piano playing, the theory and technique that would help her develop beyond her current level. The request filled me with a mixture of joy and terror, joy at the opportunity to share my knowledge, terror at the prospect of revealing how much of my own skill had deteriorated through neglect. But Uncle Robert pointed out something that hadn't occurred to me. My work as a music therapist had actually kept me more connected to music than I had realized. The skills I used to help children process trauma through sound and rhythm were deeply rooted in the musical foundation I had received in this very room. I had not abandoned music after all. I had simply found a different way to channel its healing power. The realization hit me like a revelation. All those years when I thought I had turned my back on my musical heritage, I had actually been living it out in a different form. The lullabies I sang to frightened children in hospital beds were connected to the songs my grandmother had sung to me. The rhythmic exercises I used to help patients regain motor skills were variations on the same techniques my mother had used to teach me proper fingering and timing. I began to tell them about my work, describing how music could unlock communication in children with autism, how rhythm could help stroke patients regain speech patterns, how melody could provide comfort to families facing impossible losses. As I spoke, I saw understanding dawn in their faces, recognition that my path had been different but not disconnected, that I had found a way to honor our family's musical legacy even while maintaining my independence. Emma listened with particular fascination, asking detailed questions about the therapeutic applications of music. Her interest sparked conversations about the intersection of art and healing, about the responsibility that comes with musical gifts, about the ways that creativity can serve purposes beyond entertainment or personal expression. Patricia, who worked as a nurse, began to share her own observations about the role of music in medical settings. She described how patients responded to familiar songs, how rhythm could help regulate breathing and heart rate, how harmony could create a sense of calm in chaotic situations. Our conversation began to weave together the threads of music, healing, and family connection in ways I had never considered. As midnight approached, the youngest family members began to show signs of fatigue. Parents gathered sleepy children, collecting coats and car keys as they prepared to return to their own homes. But before anyone could leave, Emma made an announcement that surprised us all. She asked if we could perform our family song one more time, but with a specific modification. She wanted to record it, to create a permanent memory of this reunion that could be shared with family members who hadn't been able to attend. More importantly, she wanted to create something that could be passed down to future generations, ensuring that our musical tradition would survive even if we were separated again by distance or circumstance. The idea was met with immediate enthusiasm. Uncle Robert produced his phone, a device that seemed comically small in his carpenter's hands, but which he assured us had excellent recording capabilities. We gathered around the piano once more, adjusting our positions to ensure that all voices would be captured clearly. This final performance felt different from our earlier attempts. There was a solemnity to it, an awareness that we were creating something significant. Emma's introduction was formal, stating the date and the occasion, naming each family member present as if she were documenting a historical event. When we began to sing, our voices blended with the unconscious ease of people who had always belonged together. The harmony was richer now, deepened by the emotional connection we had reestablished over the course of the evening. Patricia's descant soared above the melody with confidence, while Uncle Robert's bass provided a steady foundation that anchored us all. My own voice found its place in the texture, weaving between melody and harmony in the way my mother had taught me so many years ago. I could almost hear her voice joining ours, adding the missing alto line that would have completed our family chord. For the first time since her death, I felt her presence as a blessing rather than a source of guilt and regret. As the song drew to its close, we held the final chord longer than usual, reluctant to break the spell that our combined voices had created. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the echo of harmonies that seemed to linger in the air like incense. Emma stopped the recording and immediately played it back, her eyes bright with excitement as she heard the playback through the phone's small speaker. The sound quality was surprisingly good, capturing not just our voices, but the subtle background sounds that would help preserve the memory. The crackling of the fire, the gentle creaking of the old house, the soft shuffle of feet on hardwood floors. But more than technical quality, the recording captured something ineffable, the sound of a family reunited, of voices that belonged together finding their way back into harmony. As we listened, I felt a deep sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken for 23 years had finally been closed. Patricia suggested that we make copies for everyone, creating a shared musical memory that could serve as a reminder of this evening's healing. She volunteered to have professional copies made, perhaps with individual recordings of each family member sharing their memories of the reunion. The project would give us an excuse to maintain contact, to build on the foundation we had reestablished tonight. As family members began their final preparations to leave, I found myself reluctant to say goodbye. The fear that had driven me away so many years ago had been replaced by its opposite, terror, that this magical reconnection might somehow evaporate with the morning light. Sarah seemed to sense my anxiety and offered the guest room, suggesting that I stay for the remainder of the holiday weekend. The invitation was exactly what I needed to hear. I accepted gratefully, already imagining the conversations we would have over breakfast, the photographs we would look through, the stories we would continue to share. Emma immediately began planning our musical activities for the following day, suggesting that we work on some of the other songs in my grandmother's collection. Uncle Robert paused at the door, his coat halfway on, and turned back to address the room. His voice carried the weight of authority that had always made him the unofficial patriarch of our extended family. He said that tonight had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that families are like songs, made up of individual voices that create something beautiful only when they come together in harmony. He looked directly at me as he continued, stating that a song with missing parts could still be beautiful, but it would never be complete. He said that our family song had been incomplete for too many years, and that having all the voices back together felt like coming home in the deepest sense of the word. Aunt Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her emotional nature on full display as she hugged each person goodbye. She whispered to me that this had been the most meaningful Christmas celebration in years, that the gift of my presence was worth more than anything that could be wrapped in paper and placed under a tree. As the last car pulled away from the house, Sarah, Emma, and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The Christmas tree lights twinkled in the semi-darkness, creating an atmosphere of peaceful intimacy. Emma curled up on the sofa with her phone, already working on ways to enhance our recording. She was researching audio editing applications, determined to create the best possible version of our family song. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding me of my own passion for music at her age, before complications and disappointments had clouded my relationship with artistic expression. Sarah and I settled into the comfortable chairs flanking the fireplace, positions that allowed us to talk quietly without disturbing Emma's concentration. The familiar creak of the chairs took me back to countless conversations we had shared in this same spot during our teenage years, when we had solved the world's problems between midnight and dawn on numerous occasions. Sarah asked about my life in Seattle, about the patients I worked with, and the colleagues who had become my chosen family during my years of self-imposed exile. I found myself describing not just the facts of my daily existence, but the emotional landscape of a life lived at a distance from deep connection. I had been successful professionally, respected in my field, financially secure, but I had also been fundamentally alone in ways I was only beginning to acknowledge. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that revealed her deep understanding of the person I had once been and was becoming again. Sarah had always possessed an emotional intelligence that made her a natural confidant, someone who could draw out truths that people had hidden even from themselves. As I talked, I began to realize how much energy I had expended over the years maintaining my emotional defenses. The constant vigilance required to keep family connections at bay had been exhausting, a full-time job that had left little energy for genuine intimacy with anyone. I had convinced myself that independence was the same as freedom, but tonight I was beginning to understand the difference. Emma looked up from her phone, interrupting our conversation with an excited announcement. She had found a way to isolate individual voice parts from our recording, which would allow family members to learn their harmonies more easily. She demonstrated by playing back just the bass line, Uncle Robert's voice isolated and clear against the silence. The technology amazed me, reminding me how much the world had changed during my years of deliberate disconnection. But more than the technical innovation, I was struck by Emma's instinctive understanding of how to use these tools to strengthen family bonds. She was naturally thinking about ways to include absent family members, to create learning opportunities that would ensure our musical tradition could continue to grow and evolve. Sarah suggested that Emma might want to pursue music education as a career, pointing out her natural teaching instincts and her talent for bringing people together through shared musical experiences. The suggestion clearly appealed to Emma, who began talking enthusiastically about the possibility of combining music with technology to create new forms of artistic expression. As we talked, I found myself thinking about the concept of legacy, about the ways that traditions survive and adapt across generations. My grandmother's Irish song had somehow found its way to Emma's generation, carried forward by determined family members who understood its importance even when one link in the chain was missing. Now Emma was transforming it again, using modern technology to preserve and share it in ways my grandmother could never have imagined. The conversation gradually shifted to plans for the following day. Sarah suggested that we visit my grandmother's grave, an idea that filled me with both longing and dread. I had not been to the cemetery since my grandfather's funeral 15 years earlier, and the thought of facing my grandmother's final resting place brought up emotions I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. But Emma's enthusiasm for the idea helped tip the balance. She wanted to bring her phone and play our recording at the graveside, a gesture that struck me as both touching and appropriate. She pointed out that my grandmother had always said that music was a language that transcended death, a way of maintaining connection across any distance or barrier. Sarah agreed to come with us, understanding that I would need support for what was likely to be an emotional experience. She suggested that we bring flowers from the garden my grandmother had tended for 60 years, some of which were still blooming despite the December cold. The idea of creating a bridge between my grandmother's living legacy and her memory felt both healing and necessary. As the evening wound down, Emma retreated to her room with promises to work on enhancing our recording while we adults prepared for sleep. Sarah showed me to the guest room, a cozy space that had been my cousin Marcus's bedroom during our childhood. The walls still bore faint traces of the posters he had hung as a teenager, and the window looked out on the same backyard where we had played countless games of hide and seek among my grandmother's flower beds. Sarah lingered in the doorway, and I could sense that she had something important to say. Finally, she told me that she had never stopped hoping I would come home, that she had written me dozens of letters over the years that she had never sent. She had kept track of my address changes through mutual friends, maintaining a file of information about my life that she thought I might want to see someday. The revelation that she had been quietly maintaining our connection, even during my deliberate absence, moved me to tears. I had spent so many years convinced that I had been forgotten, that my departure had been a relief to family members who no longer had to deal with my difficult personality and stubborn independence. To learn that Sarah had been holding space for me all along felt like a gift I had never dared to hope for. She left me with a shoebox full of unsent letters, photographs from family gatherings I had missed, and newspaper clippings about my professional achievements that she had carefully collected. The box represented decades of love and attention that I had never known existed, a secret archive of caring that had persisted despite my absence. I spent the night reading through Sarah's unsent correspondence, marveling at her consistent faith that our relationship could be restored. Her letters chronicled major family events, but also smaller moments. Emma's first piano recital, Uncle Robert's retirement party, Patricia's daughter's graduation from college. Each letter was an invitation to return, a gentle reminder that I was missed and that a place was being held for me at the family table. The photographs were particularly powerful, showing me the faces of family members as they aged, capturing moments of joy and sorrow that I had missed entirely. There were pictures of Christmas mornings where my absence was obvious, gaps in the family groupings where I should have been standing. But there were also images of new traditions, new celebrations, new family members who had been born into our extended clan during my years away. One photograph stopped me cold, a picture of Emma at age 12, sitting at the piano with a look of fierce concentration as she worked through a difficult piece. The resemblance to myself at that age was startling, but more than physical similarity, I recognized the expression of someone discovering the transformative power of music. In that moment, I understood that my musical legacy had survived my absence, passed down through bloodlines and family connections that transcended any individual's presence or participation. When I finally turned off the light, my dreams were filled with music. I heard my grandmother's voice teaching me the Irish song, felt my mother's hands guiding mine across the piano keys, experienced again the joy of perfect harmony created by voices that belong together. But I also dreamed of new music, of songs that had yet to be written, of harmonies that would include Emma's generation and the children who would come after her. Morning came with the sound of bacon sizzling in the kitchen and coffee brewing in the old percolator that had been my grandmother's pride and joy. The familiar domestic sounds drew me downstairs, where I found Sarah and Emma already deep in discussion about our plans for the day. Emma had spent hours working on our recording, creating individual practice tracks for each family member and experimenting with different arrangements of the harmony parts. She played her enhanced version of our song, and I was amazed by the clarity and richness she had achieved. But more than technical improvement, she had somehow captured the emotional essence of our reunion, the sense of completion that had filled the room when our voices came together after 23 years of separation. Over breakfast, we planned our visit to the cemetery, discussing what we wanted to say and do when we reached my grandmother's grave. Emma had prepared a brief speech about the importance of musical traditions and the power of family connections that transcend death. Sarah had selected flowers from the winter garden, hardy blooms that would survive the December cold and provide color against the gray landscape of the cemetery. The drive to the cemetery took us through the center of town, past landmarks that triggered floods of memories. The school where I had given my first piano recital still stood on Main Street, though it now housed a community center. The music store where my mother had bought my first piano method books had been replaced by a coffee shop, but the building's basic structure remained unchanged. Sarah pointed out changes I had missed during my absence. New businesses, renovated buildings, families who had moved away or moved in. The town had evolved without me, adapting and growing in ways that reminded me that life continues regardless of who participates and who chooses to remain on the sidelines. The cemetery occupied a hill overlooking the town, its mature trees providing shade even in winter. My grandmother's grave was located in the older section, near the resting places of generations of family members, whose names I remembered from stories and genealogical discussions. The headstone was simple, but elegant, bearing her name and dates along with a brief inscription about her role as beloved mother and grandmother. Standing at her grave, I was overwhelmed by the finality of death, but also by the continuity it represented. My grandmother's body rested here, but her influence lived on in the musical traditions she had preserved, the family connections she had nurtured, the love she had expressed through countless acts of care and attention. Emma's presence beside me was proof that some legacies transcend individual lifespans, passing from generation to generation through channels deeper than conscious memory. Emma began to play our recording, the sound of our combined voices floating across the cemetery like a blessing. Other visitors paused in their own memorial activities, drawn by the beauty of the harmony and the obvious emotion behind the performance. As the song reached its climactic moments, I felt my grandmother's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside us, adding her own voice to the chorus of family connection. When the recording ended, we stood in silence, each lost in our own thoughts and memories. But gradually, spontaneously, we began to sing the song again, our living voices carrying the melody across the winter landscape. This time, our performance felt like a gift offered to all the family members who rested in this peaceful place, a promise that their legacies would continue through us and through the generations that would come after us. The drive home was contemplative, each of us processing the emotional weight of our cemetery visit. But as we pulled into Sarah's driveway, Emma announced that she had one more surprise for our weekend reunion. She had contacted other family members and arranged for an impromptu gathering that evening, a chance for everyone to come together once more before I returned to Seattle. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. The previous evening's reunion had been magical, but it had also been spontaneous, without time for anxiety or second-guessing. Tonight's gathering would be different, planned, and anticipated, carrying the weight of expectations that might be impossible to fulfill. But Sarah and Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and I soon found myself helping with preparations for what promised to be a memorable evening. We spent the afternoon cooking traditional family dishes, setting up extra seating in the living room, and preparing the piano area for another musical celebration. As family members began to arrive, I was struck by the difference in atmosphere from the previous evening. Tonight there was no shock or surprise, no tentative approaches or uncertain welcomes. Instead, There was a warm familiarity, as if my 23-year absence had been compressed into a brief intermission that was now definitively over. The evening's musical celebration was even more elaborate than our spontaneous reunion had been. Emma had created practice recordings for family members who wanted to learn harmony parts, and several people had spent the day rehearsing their individual contributions to our collective song. The result was a performance of unprecedented richness and complexity, showcasing the musical talents that ran through every branch of our family tree. But the most meaningful moment came when Patricia stood up to make an announcement. She had been thinking about our conversation the previous evening, she said, about the years we had lost and the connections we were reestablishing. She wanted to propose a formal tradition, an annual family musical gathering, held every Christmas Eve, where we would perform our traditional songs and learn new ones. The proposal was met with immediate and enthusiastic agreement. Emma volunteered to serve as the family musical director, coordinating rehearsals and maintaining our growing repertoire of songs. Uncle Robert offered his workshop as a space for storing music and equipment. Aunt Margaret promised to document our performances, creating a permanent record of our family's musical evolution. As the evening progressed, we began to plan not just next year's gathering, but the musical legacy we wanted to create for future generations. We talked about teaching young family members to play instruments, about preserving the stories behind traditional songs, about creating new musical traditions that would reflect our contemporary experiences while honoring our historical roots. I found myself volunteering to coordinate with family members who lived at a distance, to ensure that our musical tradition could include those who might not be able to attend every gathering in person. My experience with technology-mediated music therapy gave me ideas about how we could create virtual performances, allowing separated family members to contribute their voices to our collective harmony. The conversation gradually expanded beyond music to encompass broader themes of family connection and mutual support. We talked about staying in touch between gatherings, about sharing important news and celebrations, about creating a network of caring that could provide support during difficult times. As the evening drew to a close, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of family relationships. For years, I had seen family connection as a limitation, a constraint on my independence and autonomy. But tonight, I was beginning to understand that true belonging actually enhances individual freedom, providing a secure foundation from which to explore and grow. The musical tradition we were rekindling was not about conformity or obligation, but about creating something beautiful together that none of us could achieve alone. Our individual voices were strengthened by their place in the harmony, just as our individual lives were enriched by their connection to the larger family story. When it came time for final goodbyes, the farewells were different from the previous evening's tentative separations. Tonight there was confidence that this reunion was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a renewed relationship that would continue to develop over time. We made specific plans for staying in touch, set dates for future gatherings, and exchanged contact information with the enthusiasm of people embarking on an exciting new adventure. Emma presented me with a thumb drive containing all the recordings she had made over the weekend, along with the enhanced versions she had created using her audio editing software. But more than technical artifacts, she gave me something invaluable: the knowledge that our family's musical tradition was in capable hands, ready to evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential character. Patricia's goodbye was particularly meaningful, carrying the weight of our renewed friendship and the promise of continued connection. She made me promise to visit again soon, not waiting for another major family event or crisis. She wanted our relationship to develop gradually, built on regular contact and shared experiences rather than dramatic reunions separated by years of silence. Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret's farewells carried the blessing of the older generation, the satisfaction of seeing family harmony restored under their watch. They had been the keepers of family tradition during my absence, and their joy at my return felt like official recognition that I was once again a full member of the family community. As the last car pulled away, Sarah, Emma, and I found ourselves once more in the quiet living room, surrounded by the pleasant debris of a successful gathering. The piano bench still held the sheet music we had used, the family song written in my grandmother's careful script, annotated with my mother's penciled suggestions, now marked with Emma's contemporary additions. Emma asked if I would consider moving back to town, a question that caught me off guard with its directness and innocence. The idea had not consciously occurred to me, but as she spoke, I found myself seriously considering the possibility. My work as a music therapist could potentially be practiced anywhere, and the family connections I had reestablished felt more valuable than the professional networks I had built in Seattle. Sarah was more circumspect, understanding the complexity of such a major life change. She pointed out that I could maintain my renewed family connections regardless of where I lived, that the important thing was emotional availability rather than physical proximity. But she also made it clear that I would be welcomed back to the community with open arms if I chose to return. The conversation continued late into the night, exploring possibilities and practicalities, dreams and concerns. But underneath the specific details was a larger question about the relationship between individual identity and family belonging, about how much of myself I was willing to integrate with the collective family story. By the time we finally said goodnight, I had not made any definitive decisions about my future plans. But I had gained something perhaps more valuable. The knowledge that choices were available to me that I had not previously considered, that returning home was a possibility rather than a betrayal of the independence I had worked so hard to achieve. My final night in the guest room was filled with dreams that wove together past and future, individual aspirations, and collective belonging. I dreamed of playing piano in the hospital where I worked, but this time the music was our family song, and my young patients were learning the harmony parts. I dreamed of Emma as an adult, teaching her own children the Irish melody that had been passed down through generations of strong women. But most vividly, I dreamed of Christmas mornings yet to come, filled with music and laughter, with voices blended in harmony and hearts connected by bonds that transcended any temporary separation. In my dreams, the song my cousin sang had indeed united our family again, not just for one magical weekend, but for all the celebrations that lay ahead. When morning came, I woke with a sense of completion that I had not experienced in decades. The weekend had given me everything I had not dared to hope for: forgiveness, acceptance, connection, and the restoration of relationships I had feared were permanently broken. But more than healing old wounds, it had opened possibilities for new growth, new traditions, new ways of being part of a family while maintaining individual identity. Emma bounded into the guest room early, already dressed and eager to begin our final day together. She had planned a morning of music making, wanting to learn as much as possible before my departure. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding me of the joy that music could bring when it was shared with people who understood its value. We spent the morning at the piano, working through songs from my grandmother's collection, exploring harmonies and arrangements that showcased Emma's growing skill. But we also talked about the broader implications of musical tradition, about the responsibility that comes with inherited gifts, about the ways that creativity can serve both individual expression and community connection. As the time for my departure approached, Emma made a final request that surprised me with its maturity and insight. She asked if I would write down everything I remembered about my grandmother's approach to teaching music, about the techniques and philosophies that had shaped our family's musical education. She wanted to preserve this knowledge for future generations, ensuring that the wisdom would not be lost even if the direct transmission was interrupted. The request gave me a project that would extend our connection beyond the weekend, a reason to maintain regular contact as I worked to document memories and insights that had been buried for decades. It also offered a way to contribute meaningfully to Emma's musical development, sharing expertise that could help her become not just a skilled performer, but a wise teacher who understood the deeper purposes of musical expression. Sarah drove me to the train station through streets that now felt familiar rather than foreign, past landmarks that connected me to a history I had tried to abandon but could never truly escape. Our conversation during the drive focused on practical matters: when I would visit again, how we would stay in touch, what role I wanted to play in future family gatherings. But underneath the logistics was a deeper understanding that something fundamental had changed over the weekend. I was no longer the family member who had left in anger and stayed away in pride. I was also not exactly the person I had been before my departure, shaped as I was by years of independence and professional accomplishment. Instead, I was becoming something new. Someone who could belong to a family while maintaining individual identity. Someone who could contribute to collective harmony while preserving personal voice. The train ride back to Seattle gave me hours to process the experiences of the weekend, to begin integrating the emotional shifts that had occurred during my family reunion. I spent much of the journey listening to the recordings Emma had made, hearing our voices blend in harmonies that represented not just musical skill, but emotional connection, not just individual talent, but collective achievement. As familiar landmarks began to appear outside the train windows, marking my approach to the city I had called home for so many years, I felt a strange sense of displacement. Seattle had been my refuge, the place where I had built a life independent of family complications and inherited expectations. But now it felt somehow incomplete, lacking the deep connections that had been restored over the weekend. The weeks that followed my return were filled with reflection and planning. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, finding that my restored family connections had somehow deepened my ability to help patients heal through music. The techniques I had learned from my grandmother, the understanding of harmony that had been passed down through generations, informed my therapeutic practice in ways I had never fully appreciated. But I also began to make concrete changes in my life that reflected my shifting priorities. I started regular video calls with Emma, helping her work through challenging pieces and discussing the broader role of music in human experience. I established a weekly phone conversation with Sarah, maintaining the intimate friendship that had been rekindled during our reunion. Most significantly, I began planning a major change that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. I started exploring opportunities to relocate my practice, to find ways of serving patients while living closer to the family connections that had been restored. The process was complex, requiring careful coordination with colleagues and patients, but it felt like a natural evolution of the person I was becoming. Christmas approached with unprecedented meaning, carrying the promise of our newly established tradition and the joy of belonging to something larger than myself. Emma had been busy throughout the year, learning new songs and teaching harmony parts to younger family members. Sarah had coordinated with relatives scattered across the country, ensuring that everyone would be able to participate in our celebration either in person or through technology. When I arrived at the family home on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after my initial return, I was greeted not as a surprise visitor, but as an expected and cherished family member. The house was filled with decorations that included new additions, photographs from our previous year's reunion, sheet music for songs we had learned together, and a special place of honor for the recording equipment that had become essential to our musical tradition. Emma, now 17 and even more confident in her musical abilities, had prepared an ambitious program that showcased the growth and development of our family's musical tradition over the past year. She had arranged several of our traditional songs for multiple voices and instruments, incorporating family members who played guitar, violin, and other instruments into our primarily vocal ensemble. But the most meaningful addition to our repertoire was a song that Emma had composed herself, setting to music a poem that my grandmother had written decades earlier. The piece beautifully wove together past and present, honoring our inherited traditions while creating something entirely new. When we performed it together, our voices carrying melody lines that no previous generation had sung, I felt the living presence of our musical legacy, growing and adapting while maintaining its essential character. The evening was filled with the same magic that had characterized our original reunion, but it was deeper now, built on a foundation of renewed relationships and shared commitment to family connection. We sang our traditional songs with the confidence of people who belonged together, our voices blending in harmonies that had been practiced and perfected over the course of the year. But we also created new music, experimenting with arrangements and compositions that reflected our contemporary experiences while honoring our historical roots. Children who had been too young to participate meaningfully, the previous year now added their voices to our chorus, while adults who had been tentative about their musical abilities sang with growing confidence. As the evening reached its climax, we gathered around the piano for a final performance of the Irish song that had started our reunion journey. This time, our rendition was even richer than before, incorporating the musical growth and deepened relationships that had developed over the intervening year. Emma made the recording as she had the previous year, but this time the process felt ceremonial rather than spontaneous, a formal documentation of our family's musical evolution. When we listened to the playback, we could hear not just individual voices, but the sound of a family that had chosen to remain connected, that had prioritized harmony over independence, that had learned to create beauty together. As family members prepared to leave, making plans for the following year's gathering and exchanging promises to maintain contact throughout the coming months, I realized that the song my cousin sang had indeed united our family again. But more than that, it had created a new tradition that would continue to bring us together, year after year, generation after generation. The music we had created together was more than entertainment or even artistic expression. It was a form of prayer, a declaration of commitment to each other, a promise that no matter what challenges or changes the future might bring, we would continue to find ways to blend our individual voices into something larger and more beautiful than any of us could create alone. Standing in the familiar living room, surrounded by family members whose faces glowed with satisfaction and joy, I understood finally that coming home had not meant giving up my independence or abandoning my individual identity. Instead, it had meant discovering that the most profound freedom comes from choosing to belong, from finding your voice not in isolation, but in harmony with others who share your deepest values and commitments. The song my cousin sang that Christmas Eve so many years ago had planted a seed that had taken decades to fully bloom. But now, surrounded by family members whose voices joined mine in perfect harmony, I knew that the music we created together would continue to unite us, Christmas after Christmas, for all the years to come.